Heyo, it's Jason. I thought I would share a little bit of the embroidery design process. It's rare that I have a design that I know I can do in a single sitting, so I decided I would probably fire up OBS and do a quick time-lapse of this. So this is after I've already worked out all of the vectors. This has all been laid out in after doing roughs in Photoshop and then bringing that into CorelDraw and getting all my vectors sorted and most of an idea of how I'm going to embroider it. Then I get into this process. So it usually just starts with sort of figuring out the order, moving objects around, getting an idea of where they're going to be, and then breaking them down into their individual stitches. So you can see I'm just here working with fills and angle of the stitches, which will change how it reflects the light. And it's a kind of a repetitive process that I get into, and just sort of kind of working it out, trying to figure out how I can daisy chain objects together so that the machines don't have to stop and cut the thread and tie it off. And that can speed up a lot. A lot of times it's when it's changing threads or doing tie-offs and starting again that the thread gets messed up. So if I can reduce those, it makes the design itself a lot more stable. Here I'm adding an underlay for the handle, since most of the design is, stacked on top of layer on layer. The handle's kind of floating out into space, and if this is going to be embroidered onto velvet, that could show through the lighter colors. So when I'm working with whites, I have to kind of really build up the layers so that they get some opacity to them. Can't really see it here very well, but I am kind of working out the next layers and figuring out how they can connect together, what order they're going to go in, and what types of stitches they're going to be. Bringing up the black line layer so I know where I can hide stitches, and there's a running stitch that will kind of link those two objects together so I don't have to do a jump cut in between. I'd give this design probably somewhere in the middle, like a medium, easy to, light to medium on the difficulty scale of number of objects, number of stitches. This one comes in around 29,000 stitches, and I have more complex designs that go up into the 80,000s. There's a lot of stitches to this one, but they're not, the objects themselves are fairly large and flat, so there's not as much detail as some of the more ornate ones that I do. As the design builds up, it becomes a lot more productive if I just start messing with color and putting in high contrast color so I can easily see what I'm working on. Also makes it a little bit easier for the camera to catch. There's a lot of repetition to the process as far as setting in a lot of the small settings, what kind of stitch I'm using, the pole compensations, underlay stitches, all that stuff is kind of, I could automate it, I could set that as my default settings, but then I'd risk not paying attention to those small details while I'm designing the embroideries. So I still do them manually, and just kind of forces me to walk through the designs more than once so I can catch more mistakes before I get into thread testing this on an embroidery machine. So there I'm putting in pole compensations, and that's as the embroidery thread starts pulling the fabric together, the design kind of distorts and shrinks. So I'm just stretching a little bit, and sometimes I'll lay all of the objects out, get their fills in, and then come back at the very end and worry about pole compensations and underlays. And sometimes I do them item by item. It just really depends on the state I'm in. setting the angles on that satin fill so that it kind of flares out like a mustache would. At this point, all of the colors are temporary because the computer doesn't really capture what thread looks like in the light. So I just sort of start with the colors I assume I try, and then I get into the embroidery tests and actually finalize colors and do a lot of tweaking and adjustments after the thread tests are happening. Here I'm breaking down the objects and splitting them up. I have a bit of an OCD thing where I like to make sure all of the objects are layered appropriately. So by breaking the objects up into smaller chunks, I can kind of shuffle where they are in the stitch pattern in the order so that the objects are on top of what they need to be on top of and underneath the segments that they need to be underneath. It's one of those things where I'm sure nobody would notice it in the end result, but I kind of obsess over it. And I'm using the purple color here as well as that dark teal just to isolate groups of this. They're all going to be black, but it becomes too complex to track. So by just throwing random colors in there, I can kind of keep track of what goes where in the order. Just a little cleanup. I didn't really want the overlap there. I decided to make it look like it just continues. Adjusting the color again so we can see what we're doing here. All in all, this was probably an hour 20, hour and 30 minutes of computer work to get this from vectors into embroidery. And I spent a good chunk of time with rough sketches, pencil sketch, bringing that into the computer in like Photoshop, doing a color rough on top of that, and then going into a vector drawing program like CorelDraw and laying out vectors and getting the shapes. And when I'm doing the vectors, I'm thinking about this step in the process, so I kind of get the objects in the order that I want. But as you can tell from this, I'm still juggling a lot of stuff. Here I'm adding just a short visible stitch to link those two objects together. It'll barely be noticeable in the final embroidery, but that saves me another tie off and cut. And there we go. Get quick color change, because I do want the mustache to be a different color than the T inside. So now I'm just putting in colors that I think might work in the embroidery. And the software has a function where it can kind of emulate the embroidery process. And it's a good idea to kind of take a look at the process. I can catch some mistakes before I get into the thread tests. Usually it's, when I think I've linked two objects and I didn't do it correctly, that's the kind of thing I catch watching the run through in the computer. And this is sped up on top of the sped up rendering that it's showing me. not super detailed, but sometimes I can tell when it suddenly jumps to the wrong object, and maybe I have the objects in the wrong order, or the running stitch that links two objects is running in the wrong direction. It starts and stops in the wrong place. And there were a couple, I think there was like 3 of those that I caught in here watching this run. Usually I don't catch those things until I've run an embroidery test. So I try to remember to do a run simulation, but it seldom happens. So that about wraps it up, just fixing those mistakes I had in the order. And next step would be to bring this to the embroidery machine and run it on an actual fabric. Thanks for watching, and let me know if you'd like to see more of this sort of thing.